The Wyoming wind cut through Thomas Whitmore's weathered coat like a blade seeking bone. Each shovelful of earth felt heavier than the last as he dug into the frozen ground behind his cabin, the metallic ring of iron against stone echoing across the desolate plains. The hole was nearly deep enough now, 6 feet, just like the graves he'd dug for his wife Martha and their infant son Samuel 3 months prior. Lightning split the black sky, illuminating the vast emptiness that stretched endlessly in all directions. This land had promised so much when he and Martha had arrived 5 years ago, their hearts full of dreams and their wagon loaded with hopes. The territory was supposed to be their new beginning, a place where a man could carve out something meaningful from the wilderness. Instead, it had become his tomb. At 42, Thomas looked older, worn down by loss and the relentless demands of frontier life. His once broad shoulders now seemed permanently hunched, as if carrying an invisible weight that grew heavier with each passing day. The cabin behind him stood dark and empty, its windows reflecting the lightning like dead eyes. Inside, Martha's sewing basket still sat by the window, her thimble exactly where she'd left it. The baby's cradle remained in their bedroom, the tiny quilt she'd sewn still folded neatly inside. He resumed digging, each movement mechanical, purposeful. The wooden handle of the shovel had worn smooth from years of use, building fences, planting crops, and ultimately burying the only people who had ever mattered to him. The irony wasn't lost on him that the same tool that had helped him build his life was now preparing to end it. The storm intensified, rain beginning to fall in heavy drops that turned the disturbed earth into mud. Thomas paused, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of dirt across his weathered face. Some nights, he swore he could still hear Samuel's cries echoing through the rooms, a ghost song that drove him to drink and despair. A flash of lightning revealed the crude wooden crosses marking Martha and Samuel's graves 20 yards away. Thomas had carved their names himself, his hands shaking as he worked. Beloved wife and mother and beloved son seemed like such inadequate words for people who had been his entire world. The wind picked up, howling across the prairie like a banshee's wail. Thomas's lantern flickered, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock his solitary figure. He was utterly alone out here, miles from the nearest neighbor, even farther from the small town of Broken Ridge. When he was gone, it would be weeks before anyone noticed. He climbed out of the hole, his boots slipping on the muddy edges. The grave was ready. All that remained was to retrieve the shotgun from the cabin and end this prolonged suffering. Martha had always said he was too stubborn for his own good, that he held on to pain like it was something precious. She'd been right about that, as she'd been right about most things. The cabin door groaned on its hinges as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of neglect and loneliness. The shotgun hung above the fireplace, its blue-black barrel gleaming dully in the flickering light. Thomas had used it to hunt deer and rabbits, to scare off coyotes and the occasional bear. Tonight it would serve a different purpose, but as his fingers touched the cold metal, a sound from outside made him pause. At first he thought it was just the wind, but then he heard it again, a different note in the storm's symphony. It sounded almost like crying. Thomas stood frozen, his hand still on the shotgun. The sound came again, clearer this time, carried on the wind. It was definitely human, definitely distressed. He moved to the window, wiping away the condensation with his sleeve, and peered out into the stormy darkness. Lightning flashed, and for a moment he saw nothing but rain and wind-bent grass. Then, in the brief illumination of another bolt, he glimpsed a figure stumbling through the storm. It was small, hunched against the weather, moving with the desperate determination of someone who had nowhere else to go. The figure collapsed just outside his fence line, a dark heap in the mud that didn't move again. Thomas waited, gripping the shotgun, but the person remained still. The storm raged on, washing over the fallen form with merciless intensity. For a long moment, Thomas stood paralyzed between his despair and something else, something that felt almost like the man he used to be. The rain drummed against the windows, and the wind howled its lonely song, but all he could see was that small, motionless figure lying in the mud. With a curse that was part anger, part something else entirely, Thomas grabbed his coat and lantern and headed for the door. The storm hit him like a physical blow as he stepped outside, the wind nearly knocking him backward. He fought his way through the rain and mud, the lantern swinging wildly in his grip. The figure was a young woman, maybe 20, with dark hair plastered to her head and clothes that had seen better days. She was unconscious, her face pale and streaked with mud, her lips tinged blue with cold. If he left her here, she would die within the hour. The choice should have been simple. He had already made his peace with death, had already dug his grave. But as he looked down at her face, so young and vulnerable, he found himself thinking of Martha, of what she would say if she knew he had left someone to die while he wallowed in self-pity. With a groan that was as much spiritual as physical, Thomas lifted the girl into his arms. She was lighter than he'd expected, almost fragile in her unconscious state. He carried her toward the cabin, fighting the wind and rain, his boots slipping in the mud he'd created while digging his grave. Inside the cabin, Thomas laid her gently on the bed he'd once shared with Martha. She was still shivering, her wet clothes clinging to her small frame. He hesitated for a moment, propriety warring with necessity, then began carefully removing her soaked garments. Her dress was simple but well made, though it had seen hard use. Underneath, her chemise revealed a body marked by hardship, thin from poor nutrition, with fading bruises on her arms that spoke of rough treatment. Thomas wrapped her in blankets, then built up the fire until the room was warm. He heated water and cleaned the mud from her face, revealing features that were striking despite their current pallor. Her breathing gradually became stronger, more regular, and some color returned to her cheeks. As he sat beside the bed, watching over this stranger who had literally collapsed at his doorstep, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose. For the first time since Martha and Samuel's deaths, he was needed. Someone depended on him even if she didn't know it yet. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin there was warmth and the steady rhythm of two people breathing. Thomas looked at the shotgun still leaning against the wall where he'd left it, and felt a strange disconnection from his earlier despair. The void was still there, a constant ache in his chest, but it no longer seemed like the only thing in the world. Outside, the storm that had brought this mysterious woman to his door showed no signs of abating. But inside, in the flickering firelight, Thomas Whitmore found himself doing something he hadn't done in 3 months. He was taking care of another human being, and for the first time since he'd started digging his grave, he wasn't sure he wanted to use it. Dawn broke grey and sullen over the Wyoming plains, the storm having blown itself out sometime before sunrise. Thomas had dozed fitfully in his chair, startling awake every time the girl stirred. She had been restless through the night, muttering words he couldn't quite catch, her face contorting with remembered pain. Now, as pale morning light filtered through the cabin's single window, she opened her eyes. They were the color of winter sky, pale blue and startlingly intelligent. For a moment, she lay perfectly still, taking in her surroundings with the careful assessment of someone accustomed to danger. When her gaze finally settled on Thomas, he saw wariness there, but also something else. A flicker of recognition. "Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but there was strength beneath the fragility. "My cabin," Thomas replied. "Found you collapsed in the storm last night. You were near frozen to death." She tried to sit up, wincing as she did so. Thomas moved to help her, but she flinched away from his touch. The gesture was instinctive, automatic, and it told him volumes about what she'd endured. "Easy now," he said gently, keeping his distance. "You're safe here. I'm Thomas Whitmore." The girl studied his face for a long moment, and again he had that strange feeling that she knew him somehow. "I remember you," she said finally. "You were at the trial in Broken Ridge 3 weeks ago." Thomas frowned, trying to place her. 3 weeks ago, he'd been in town getting supplies, trying to lose himself in the mindless routine of commerce. There had been some kind of commotion at the courthouse, but he'd paid it little attention. "My name is Elena Vasquez. I testified against Judge Harrison and his associates." She pulled the blankets tighter around herself. "I was their property for 2 years." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Judge Harrison was one of the most powerful men in the territory, a political appointment from back east who wielded his authority like a personal weapon. "Property?" he echoed, though he was beginning to understand. Elena's jaw tightened. "They called it employment. Said I was a housekeeper, a cook, but Judge Harrison and his friends, Sheriff Donovan, Mayor Cartwright, Banker Fleming, they had other uses for me, for girls like me. We were kept in the back rooms of the Grandview Hotel." Told we were working off debts. Told we'd be killed if we tried to leave. Thomas felt sick. He'd eaten at the Grandview Hotel, had conducted business with these men, and all the while, how did you get away? One of the other girls, Marie, she was going to have a baby. She was scared, didn't know what to do. I helped her escape one night, told her to run to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. But she was caught before she got 5 miles. They made an example of her, in front of all of us. Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. Marie was pregnant with Sheriff Donovan's child. She begged him to let her go, to let her raise the baby somewhere safe. Instead, She stopped, unable to finish. After that, I knew I had to do something. I started gathering evidence. Letters, documents, anything that could prove what they were doing. I hid it all in a hollow tree about 2 miles from town. And then I ran. To testify. Eleanor nodded. The territorial marshal believed me. He brought investigators from Cheyenne, even from Denver. They found some evidence, arrested some of the smaller players. But Harrison and his inner circle? They're too powerful, too well-connected. The trial was a sham. They had lawyers from back east, witnesses who swore I was a liar and a thief. Thomas remembered now fragments of gossip about a Mexican girl making wild accusations against upstanding citizens. He'd dismissed it, as he'd dismissed everything else that didn't concern his own pain. They acquitted them, Elena said bitterly. All of them. Said there wasn't enough evidence, that I was an unreliable witness. The judge all but called me a whore in open court. And after the trial, I was supposed to disappear quietly. They offered me money, a train ticket east, a chance to start over. All I had to do was sign a paper saying I'd lied about everything. When I refused, they decided to handle the problem differently. Thomas felt cold understanding settle over him. They came after you. 2 nights ago, I was staying at the boarding house, trying to figure out what to do next. 3 men broke into my room. They weren't interested in talking. She touched her face gingerly, and Thomas noticed fading bruises around her left eye. I got away, but just barely. I've been running ever since. Why did you come here? He asked. Elena hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Because I remembered you from the trial. You were the only one who looked angry when they read the verdict. Everyone else seemed relieved, like they just wanted the whole thing to go away. But you looked like you cared. Thomas felt shame wash over him. He had cared briefly in that moment, but then he'd walked away, returned to his own grief, his own plans for self-destruction. I don't know why I thought you might help, Elena continued. I suppose I was desperate. When the storm hit, I just started walking and somehow I ended up here. Thomas stood up, moving to prepare food. You need to eat, he said. We can figure out what to do after that. We? Elena's voice was sharp with surprise. The word had slipped out naturally, but it surprised him too. For months, he'd been thinking only in terms of I, his pain, his loss, his desire to escape. But looking at this young woman, seeing her courage in the face of overwhelming odds, he felt something stirring that he'd thought was dead. If you want, he said carefully. I can't just send you back out there to face them alone. Eleanor stared at him for a long moment, and Thomas could see her weighing his words, trying to decide if she could trust him. Finally, she nodded. Thank you, she said simply. As Thomas prepared breakfast, he found himself thinking about the men Eleanor had named. He knew them all, had done business with most of them. The idea that these pillars of the community were running a prostitution ring, that they were capable of murder, seemed almost impossible to believe. But as he watched Elena eat with the careful hunger of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days, he found himself believing her completely. Tell me about the evidence, he said. The documents you hid. Eleanor's eyes sharpened. Why? Because maybe it's not over. Maybe there's still a way to make this right. She shook her head. I told you they're too powerful. The territorial authorities are either bought or intimidated. Even if I could get to the evidence, who would I take it to? Thomas was quiet for a moment, thinking. What about the federal authorities? The territorial marshal reports to Washington, doesn't he? He tried, but Harrison has connections back east, political friends who vouch for him. Without more evidence, more witnesses. What kind of evidence would you need? Eleanor looked at him curiously. Financial records mostly, the money they made from the business. Harrison was careful to keep it separate from his legitimate income, but I saw ledgers, bank transfers. If someone could prove they were profiting from prostitution, from what amounts to slavery, where would those records be? Harrison's private office, probably, or maybe his house. He had a safe there. She paused, studying his face. Why are you asking these questions? Thomas wasn't entirely sure himself. An hour ago, he'd been ready to end his life, convinced that nothing mattered anymore. Now he was contemplating something that sounded suspiciously like a rescue mission. Because maybe we both have something to live for after all? Eleanor smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, made her look younger, but also stronger somehow. Tell me everything, Thomas said. Every detail you can remember about Harrison and his operation. If we're going to do this, we need to be smart about it. Outside, the morning sun was beginning to burn through the clouds, casting long shadows across the prairie. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, its voice sharp and wild. Thomas looked out the window at the grave he'd dug the night before, now partially filled with muddy rainwater. He thought about Martha, about what she would say if she knew he was considering helping this girl. She'd always believed that people were called to stand up for what was right, even when it was dangerous, even when it seemed hopeless. When he turned back to Eleanor, she was watching him with those winter sky eyes, and he saw something there he hadn't noticed before. Hope. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there. For the first time in months, Thomas Whitmore felt like he had a purpose beyond his own pain. The next morning brought unseasonable warmth to the Wyoming plains, as if the storm had washed away winter's last grip on the territory. Thomas stood at his kitchen window, watching Eleanor feed the chickens with the careful movements of someone still recovering from exhaustion and fear. She'd insisted on helping with the morning chores, but he could see the way she constantly scanned the horizon, alert for riders who might be coming. They had talked long into the night, piecing together a plan that seemed equal parts desperate and impossible. Elena had drawn rough maps from memory, marking the locations of Harrison's office, his house, and the various businesses owned by his associates. She'd described the layout of the Grandview Hotel, the hidden rooms where she and the other girls had been kept. The ledger will be in Harrison's personal safe, she'd said. He was paranoid about keeping records, but he was also greedy. He documented everything. Payments, percentages, even notes about which girls were assigned to which clients. A dust cloud on the horizon caught Thomas's attention, and he felt his stomach tighten. 3 riders were approaching from the direction of Broken Ridge, moving at a steady pace that suggested they knew exactly where they were going. "Elena," he called quietly. "Company coming." She looked up, following his gaze to the approaching riders. Her face went pale, but she moved with quick purpose, scattering the rest of the corn and walking calmly toward the cabin. "Do you recognize them?" Thomas asked as she joined him on the porch. Eleanor squinted at the riders. "The one in the middle, that's Deputy Marshal Crawford. The other 2, I think they're bounty hunters Harrison sometimes uses." The riders pulled up about 20 feet from the porch. Crawford was a lean man in his 40s, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of mustache that suggested he took himself seriously. The bounty hunters flanked him, one tall and cadaverous, the other short and thick-set. "Morning, Whitmore," Crawford said, touching the brim of his hat. "Sorry to bother you, but we're looking for a young woman who went missing from town a few nights back. Mexican girl, about 20 years old, dark hair, goes by the name Elena Vasquez." Thomas kept his expression neutral. "Missing, you say?" "Disappeared from her boarding house room, left all her belongings behind, which suggests she might have met with foul play." Crawford's voice carried the practiced cadence of a man who'd delivered this kind of news many times. "We're checking all the ranches and homesteads in the area." "Foul play?" Thomas repeated. "I heard she was the one who testified against Judge Harrison, made some serious accusations." Something flickered across Crawford's face, a momentary tightening around the eyes. "That's all been settled. The judge and his associates were cleared of all charges. Miss Vasquez didn't take the verdict well. There's some concern she might harm herself." The lie was so smooth, so reasonable sounding, that Thomas could almost believe it himself. "Haven't seen anyone matching that description, but I'll keep an eye out." Crawford nodded, but his attention had shifted to something behind Thomas, women's clothing hanging on the line Eleanor had strung up to dry her dress and undergarments. "Those are some fine clothes for a widower living alone," Crawford observed mildly. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. "Belonged to my wife. I've been meaning to donate them to the church, but..." He shrugged, letting grief fill the gesture. Of course, Crawford said, but Thomas could see the man wasn't entirely convinced. Mind if we take a look around? It wasn't really a request. Thomas stepped aside, gesturing toward the cabin. Help yourself. The three men dismounted and began a methodical search. They looked through the barn, the chicken coop, even the privy. One of the bounty hunters spent a long time examining the muddy area where Thomas had been digging his grave. Looks like you've been doing some digging, the man called out. Root cellar, Thomas replied. Been meaning to finish it before winter comes again. Crawford emerged from the cabin, his expression unreadable. Everything seems to be in order, he said, but his tone suggested otherwise. If you do see anything unusual, you'll let us know immediately. Of course. The three men remounted their horses, but Crawford lingered. You know, Whitmore, this territory can be a dangerous place for folks who get involved in situations that don't concern them. Sometimes good people get hurt just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Thomas met Crawford's gaze steadily. I'll keep that in mind. After the riders had disappeared, Thomas found Eleanor sitting on the floor of the cabin, her back against the wall and her knees drawn up to her chest. She was shaking slightly. They know, she said. They know I'm here. Maybe. But they can't prove it. Thomas knelt beside her. We stick to the plan. The plan is suicide, Eleanor said flatly. Broken Ridge is crawling with Harrison's men. Even if we could get to his office, even if we could open the safe, how do we get out alive? Thomas was quiet for a moment, thinking. She was right, of course. The plan they'd discussed had been born of desperation and righteous anger, not careful calculation. Maybe we don't try to get out, he said quietly. Elena stared at him. What do you mean? I mean, maybe the point isn't to escape. Maybe the point is to make sure the truth gets out, no matter what happens to us. You're talking about a suicide mission. Thomas thought about the grave he'd dug, about the months of grief and purposelessness that had brought him to this moment. I was going to die anyway. At least this way, it might mean something. Elena was quiet for a long time, studying his face. When she finally spoke, her voice was stronger. There might be another way. What do you mean? The evidence I hid, the documents, the photographs, the letters, it's not just about Harrison's operation. It's about the network that supports it. Politicians, lawmen, businessmen from 3 different territories. If we could get it to the right people. Thomas felt a stirring of hope. Where is it? Hidden in a hollow tree about 2 miles east of town. But getting there means going through Broken Ridge, and after today, they'll be watching every approach, Thomas finished. Eleanor nodded, then looked up at him with a strange expression. Unless we don't go through town. Unless we go around it, that would add 20 miles to the journey through rough country. But it's possible. Thomas considered it. The terrain east of Broken Ridge was broken and difficult, cut through with ravines and dotted with stands of timber that could provide cover. It would be dangerous, especially for someone in Elena's condition, but it might be their only chance. We'd have to leave tonight, he said. Travel by darkness, hole up during the day, and then? Then we get your evidence and figure out how to get it to someone who can't be bought or intimidated. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right. But Thomas, if we do this, there's no going back. Harrison won't rest until we're both dead. Thomas thought about Martha, about the promise he'd made to her on her deathbed to take care of himself, to keep living. He'd broken that promise, had been prepared to break it completely just 2 nights ago. But maybe this was a different kind of keeping faith. I know, he said, but some things are worth dying for. As the sun climbed higher, Thomas began preparing for what might be their last night alive. He cleaned his weapons, checked his ammunition, and packed supplies for the journey. Eleanor helped where she could, her movements growing stronger and more confident as the day wore on. As evening approached, Thomas stood once more at his window, looking out at the land that had taken everything from him and given him back something he'd never expected to find again. In the distance, he could see the lights of Broken Ridge beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Somewhere in that town, powerful men were sleeping soundly, confident in their ability to silence anyone who threatened their empire. They were about to learn that some people couldn't be silenced, and that sometimes the most dangerous enemy was the one who had nothing left to lose. The hollow tree stood like a sentinel in the pre-dawn darkness, its ancient trunk split by lightning years ago to create the perfect hiding place. Thomas kept watch while Elena retrieved the oilskin packet from its hiding place, her movements quick and efficient, despite 3 days of hard travel through the roughest country Wyoming had to offer. They had made it this far through a combination of luck, determination, and Elena's intimate knowledge of the territory's back trails. Twice they had hidden in caves while Harrison's search parties thundered past, and once they had spent an entire day pressed flat against the bottom of a ravine while bounty hunters combed the ridges above them. "Got it," Elena whispered, clutching the packet to her chest. Even in the dim starlight, Thomas could see the relief on her face. This evidence represented 2 years of careful gathering, of risking her life piece by piece to document the horrors she and the other girls had endured. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped the oilskin, revealing documents, photographs, and letters that made Thomas's blood run cold. There were financial records showing payments to various officials, correspondence discussing the procurement of new girls, and most damning of all, photographs that left no doubt about what had been happening in the back rooms of the Grandview Hotel. "My God," Thomas breathed, looking at a letter signed by Judge Harrison himself. The document outlined plans to expand the operation to other towns, with specific mention of bribing territorial officials and silencing potential witnesses. "There's more," Elena said, pointing to a small leather notebook. "That's Harrison's personal journal. He wrote down everything, names, dates, amounts paid. He was so arrogant, so sure he was untouchable, that he kept records like he was running a legitimate business." Thomas flipped through the journal, his anger growing with each page. The casual way Harrison wrote about destroying lives, about the disposal of girls who became too troublesome, made him want to ride straight back to Broken Ridge. "This is enough," he said finally. "More than enough to bring down Harrison and his entire network." Elena nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "The question is, who do we trust with it? After what happened at the trial, I'm not sure there's anyone in the territorial government who can't be bought." Thomas had been thinking about this problem for days. "There's a federal marshal in Denver, Samuel Morrison. I knew him during the war. He's the kind of man who can't be bought, can't be intimidated. Denver is 200 miles from here, and Harrison's men are watching every road. Not every road, there's a stagecoach route that runs through Miller's Crossing about 30 miles south of here. If we can get there, we can send the evidence ahead while we follow." As they started to retreat deeper into the rocks, they heard the sound they'd been dreading. Hoofbeats coming from the direction of Broken Ridge. Sheriff Donovan led the group, his face grim with determination. Behind him rode Crawford and 3 other men, all heavily armed and moving with the purposeful urgency of hunters, closing in on their prey. "They're tracking us," Elena whispered. "Somehow they know we're here." But as they got closer to what looked like a sheer cliff face, Elena grabbed his arm. "This way," she said, pulling him toward what was actually a narrow crevice in the rock, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. They pushed through the opening just as the first shouts erupted from below. The crevice led to a small canyon that Elena seemed to know well. "There's a way out on the other side, but it's dangerous." The canyon was a trap, high walls on both sides with only one way in and one way out. But Elena was leading them toward the far end, where a narrow ledge wound its way up the cliff face. "Can you make it?" Thomas asked, looking at the treacherous path. Elena's answer was to start climbing. Thomas followed, his heart pounding as loose stones skittered down into the canyon below. The ledge was barely 18 inches wide in places, with a sheer drop of nearly 100 feet. Halfway up, they heard voices echoing from the canyon floor. Donovan's men had found the passage and were following them up. Thomas looked back and saw muzzle flashes in the shadows below, heard the whine of bullets ricocheting off the rocks around them. "Keep moving," he told Elena, returning fire with his rifle. They reached the top of the cliff just as the sun cleared the horizon, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. Before them stretched a vast expanse of prairie, broken only by the thin line of the Miller's Crossing Road in the distance. "We can make it," Elena said, but Thomas could hear the exhaustion in her voice. "Not both of us," Thomas replied, making a decision that had been forming in his mind for hours. "You take the evidence and go. I'll hold them off." "No." Elena's voice was sharp with anger. "I won't leave you. You have to. This evidence is the only chance those girls will ever have for justice. If Harrison gets his hands on it, then Marie died for nothing. They all died for nothing." Elena stared at him, and Thomas could see the war raging in her eyes. Finally, she nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Promise me something," she said. "Promise me you'll make them pay." Thomas took the oilskin packet from her hands. "I promise." Eleanor kissed him on the cheek. Then she was gone, running toward the distant road with the speed of desperation. Thomas turned back toward the cliff edge, checking his weapons. The first head appeared over the cliff edge just as Thomas had expected. He put a bullet through the man's hat, sending him scrambling back down the ledge. For the next 10 minutes, Thomas fought a running battle along the rim of the canyon, using every trick he'd learned during his years as a soldier. But ammunition was running low, and more men kept appearing. Finally, inevitably, they flanked him. Thomas found himself surrounded, his back to a cluster of boulders, facing 6 armed men with Sheriff Donovan in the lead. "Drop your weapons, Whitmore," Donovan called out. "You're done." Thomas looked at the faces arrayed against him. Hard men who had sold their souls for Harrison's gold. "Where's the girl?" "She won't get far. We've got men on the road, men in every town between here and Denver." "Maybe," Thomas said, "but delay is all she needs." "What did you do?" Thomas smiled, thinking of the second packet he'd prepared the night before, hidden in his saddlebags. "I sent copies of the evidence to 3 different newspapers, to the territorial governor and to a federal marshal in Denver. Even if you catch Elena, the truth is already out there." It was a lie, but a convincing one. Thomas could see the uncertainty in Donovan's eyes. "You're bluffing," Donovan said. "Am I? Harrison always said I was too stupid to be dangerous. Maybe he was wrong." Before Donovan could respond, the sound of galloping hooves echoed across the prairie. Thomas looked toward the road and saw Elena, but she wasn't alone. A group of riders was approaching from the west, federal marshals. "Jesus Christ," one of Donovan's men breathed. "That's Marshal Morrison." Thomas felt a surge of triumph. Eleanor had made it to the road, had found the very man Thomas had hoped to reach. "It's over, Donovan," Thomas said. "Your boss is finished." Sheriff Donovan's face went through a series of expressions: anger, fear, calculation. Finally, he raised his gun. "Maybe Harrison's finished, but you won't be around to see it." The gunshot rang out across the prairie, but Thomas felt no pain. Instead, he watched in amazement as Donovan spun around, his weapon flying from his hand. Crawford was holding a smoking pistol. "I'm sorry, Sheriff," Crawford said, his voice heavy with regret, "but I can't be part of this anymore." Crawford kept his gun trained on Donovan, who was clutching his wounded shoulder. "I've been working with Marshal Morrison for months, gathering evidence, building a case. When Elena testified, it gave us the opening we needed." Thomas stared at him. "You're undercover?" "Have been for the better part of a year. Harrison's operation was too big, too well protected to take down from the outside. We needed someone on the inside." As if summoned by his words, Marshal Morrison and his men reached the top of the cliff. The federal marshal was a tall, lean man with prematurely gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Deputy Crawford," he said, "report." "Evidence secured, sir. Miss Vasquez has the primary packet, but Mr. Whitmore here has been instrumental in the operation." Morrison's gaze settled on Thomas. "Tom Whitmore, I heard you were dead." "Close enough," Thomas replied, "but not quite." Morrison smiled. "Good to see you again, Tom. I could use men like you in my organization." As the federal marshals secured Donovan and his men, Thomas looked out across the prairie toward Broken Ridge. Somewhere in that town, Judge Harrison was probably just waking up, unaware that his world was about to come crashing down around him. "What happens now?" Thomas asked. Morrison followed his gaze toward the distant town. "Now we finish what that brave girl started. We round up Harrison and his associates, we shut down their operation, and we make sure they pay for what they've done. And the girls, the ones who are still trapped, they'll be freed," Morrison said firmly. "And they'll be protected. I give you my word on that." Thomas nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. It was really over. The nightmare that had consumed Elena's life, that had cost so many innocent girls their freedom and their lives, was finally coming to an end. As they made their way down from the cliff, Thomas caught sight of Elena waiting by the road. She looked small and fragile in the morning light, but he could see the strength in her posture, the determination that had carried her through 2 years of hell and brought her to this moment of triumph. When she saw him, she ran toward him with tears streaming down her face. He caught her in his arms, holding her tight as she sobbed against his chest. "It's over," he whispered. "It's finally over." Eleanor pulled back to look at him, her winter sky eyes bright with tears and something else. Hope. "No," she said. "It's not over. It's just beginning." Thomas looked out across the prairie, toward the town where justice would finally be served, and understood what she meant. The nightmare was ending, but the work of healing, of rebuilding, of creating something better from the ashes of corruption was just beginning. For the first time in months, Thomas Whitmore felt like he had a future worth living for. And as he stood there with Elena in his arms, watching the sun rise over the Wyoming plains, he knew that Martha would be proud of what he'd become. The grave he'd dug for himself could remain empty. The man who had been ready to die had found something worth living for, and in saving Elena, he had saved himself. In the distance, church bells began to ring in Broken Ridge, calling the faithful to morning worship. But today, Thomas thought, justice would be the only sermon that mattered. 2 weeks later, as Thomas stood in the courthouse in Cheyenne watching Judge Harrison and his associates being led away in chains, he felt Eleanor's hand slip into his. The federal trial had been swift and decisive. Morrison's evidence, combined with Elena's testimony and the documents they'd recovered, had proven overwhelming. Harrison's network of corruption had crumbled like a house of cards, and the girls who had been trapped in his web of exploitation were finally free. "What will you do now?" Elena asked, as they walked out into the bright Wyoming sunshine. Thomas looked at her, this remarkable young woman who had changed his life with her courage and determination. "I was thinking maybe it's time to start living again, maybe help other people who need it." Elena smiled, that same transformative expression that had given him hope in his darkest hour. She said, "maybe it's time for us to start living again." Thomas squeezed her hand, feeling the warmth of her touch, the promise of a future he'd never thought possible. The past would always be with him. Martha and Samuel would always hold a place in his heart. But Elena had shown him that life could still have meaning, that love could take many forms, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give is simply refusing to give up. As they walked down the dusty street of Cheyenne, Thomas Whitmore looked up at the vast Wyoming sky and felt something he hadn't experienced in a very long time: gratitude. Gratitude for second chances, for unexpected heroism, for the mysterious ways that one person's courage could ignite a flame of justice that no amount of corruption could extinguish. The grave behind his cabin would remain empty, slowly filling with wildflowers that Elena had planted there in memory of all those who hadn't lived to see justice done. It had become not a symbol of death, but of transformation, a reminder that sometimes we have to die to who we were in order to become who we're meant to be. And in the years that followed, as Thomas and Elena worked together to help other victims of exploitation and corruption, that empty grave would serve as a testament to the power of compassion, the strength found in helping others, and the truth that sometimes the smallest gesture, offering shelter to a stranger in a storm, can change everything.